History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 1. Before History. Beginnings. Introduction. When does history begin? It is tempting to reply, in the beginning, but like many obvious answers, this soon turns out to be unhelpful. As a great Swiss historian once pointed out in another connection, history is the one subject where you cannot begin at the beginning. We can trace the chain of human descent back to the appearance of vertebrates or even to the photosynthetic cells and other basic structures which lie at the start of life itself. We can go back further still to almost unimaginable upheavals which formed this planet and even to the origins of the universe. Yet, this is not history. Common sense helps here. History is the story of mankind, of what it has done, suffered, or enjoyed. We all know that dogs and cats do not have histories, while human beings do. Even when historians write about a natural process beyond human control, such as the ups and downs of climate or the spread of a disease, they do so only because it helps us to understand why men and women have lived and died in some ways rather than others. This suggests that all we have to do is to identify the moment at which the first human beings stepped out from the shadows of the remote past. It is not quite as simple as that, though. First, we have to know what we are looking for. But most attempts to define humanity on the basis of observable characteristics prove in the end arbitrary and cramping as long arguments about ape men and missing links have shown. Psychological tests help us classify data but do not identify what is or is not human. This is a matter of a definition about which disagreement is possible. Some people have suggested that the human uniqueness lies in language, yet, other primates possess vocal equipment similar to our own. When noises are made with it, which are signals, at what point do they become speech? Another famous definition is that man is a tool maker, but observation has cast doubt on our uniqueness in this respect. 2. Long after Dr. Johnson scoffed at Boswell for quoting it to him. What is surely and identifiably unique about the human species is not its possession of certain faculties or physical characteristics, but what it has done with them, its achievement or history. In fact, humanity's unique achievement is its remarkably intense level of activity and creativity, its cumulative capacity to create change. All animals have ways of living, some complex enough to be called cultures. Human culture alone is progressive. It has been increasingly built by conscious choice and selection within it, as well as by accident and natural pressure, by the accumulation of a capital of experience and knowledge which man has exploited. Human history began when the inheritance of genetics and behavior, which had until then provided the only way of dominating the environment, was first broken through by conscious choice. Of course, human beings have always been able to make their history within limits. These limits are now very wide indeed, but they were once so narrow that it is impossible to identify the first step which took human evolution away from the determination of nature. We have for a long time only a blurred story, obscure, both because the evidence is fragmentary and because we cannot be sure exactly what we are looking for. 1. Foundations. The roots of history lie in the pre human past And it is hard to grasp just how long ago that was. If we think of a century on our calendar as a minute on some great clock recording the passage of time, then white Europeans began to settle in the Americas only about 5 minutes ago. Slightly less than 15 minutes before that, Christians appeared. Rather, more than an hour ago, a people settled in southern Mesopotamia who were soon to evolve the oldest civilization known to us. This is already well beyond the furthest margin of written record. According to our clock, people began writing down the past much less than an hour ago, too. Some 6 or 7 hours further back on our scale and much more remote, we can discern the first recognizable human beings of the modern physiological type already established in the Western Europe. Behind them, anything from a fortnight to 3 weeks earlier, appeared the first traces of creatures with some man like characteristics, whose contribution to the evolution which followed is still in debate. How much further back into a growing darkness we need to go in order to understand the origins of a man? That is debatable, but it is worth considering for a moment even larger tracts of time, simply because so much happened in them, which, even if we cannot say anything very precise about it, shaped what followed. This is because humanity was to carry forward into historical times certain possibilities and limitations, and they were settled long ago in a past even more remote than the much shorter period of time, 3 or 4 million years or so, in which creatures with at least some claim to human qualities are known to have existed. Though it is not our direct concern, we need to try to understand what was in the baggage of advantages and disadvantages with which man alone among the primates emerged after these huge tracts of time as a change maker. Virtually all the physical and much of the mental formations we still take for granted was by then determined, fixed in the sense that some possibilities were excluded and others were not. The crucial process is the evolution of man like creatures as a distinct branch among the primates, for it is at this fork in the line, as it were, that we begin to look out for the station at which we get off for history. It is here that we can hope to find the first signs that of positive conscious impact upon environment, which marks the first stage of human achievement. The bedrock of the story is the earth itself. Changes recorded in fossils of flora and fauna, in geographical forms and geological strata, narrate a drama of epic scale lasting hundreds of millions of years. During them, the shape of the world changed out of recognition many times. Great rifts opened and closed in its surface. Coasts rose and fell. At times, huge areas were covered with a long since vanished vegetation. Many species of plants and animals emerged and proliferated. Most died out. Yet these dramatic events happened with almost unimaginable slowness. Some lasted millions of years, even the most rapid took centuries. The creatures who lived while they were going on could no more have perceived them than could a 20th century butterfly in its 3 weeks or so of life, sense of rhythm of the seasons. Yet, slowly, the earth was taking shape as a collection of habitats permitting different strains to survive. Meanwhile, biological evolution inched forwards with almost inconceivable slowness. Climate was the first great pacemaker of change. About 40 million years ago, an early enough point at which to begin to grapple with our story. Long, warm, climatic phase began to draw to a close. It had favored the great reptiles, and during it, Antarctica had separated from Australia. There were no ice fields then in any part of the globe. As the world grew colder and the new climatic conditions restricted their habitat, the great reptiles disappeared. Though some have argued that other factors than environmental change were decisive. But the new conditions suited other animal strains, which were already about, among them some mammals whose tiny ancestors had appeared 200 million years or so earlier. They now inherited the earth or a considerable part of it. With many breaks in the sequence and accidents of selection on the way, these strains were themselves to evolve into the mammals which occupy our own world, ourselves included. Crudely summarized, the main lines of this evolution were probably determined for millions of years by astronomical cycles. As the Earth's position changed in relation to the Sun, so did the climate. A huge pattern emerges of recurrent swings of temperature. The extremes which resulted of climatic cooling on the one hand and aridity on the other choked off some possible lines of development. Conversely, in other times and in certain places, the onset of appropriately benign conditions allowed certain species to flourish and encouraged their spread into new habitats. The only major subdivision of this immensely long process which concerns us comes very recently, in prehistoric terms, slightly less than 4 million years ago. There then began a period of climatic changes which we believe to have been more rapid and violent than any observed in earlier times. Rapid, we must again remind ourselves in a comparative term. These changes took tens of thousands of years. Such a pace of change, though, looks very different from the millions of years of much steadier conditions which lay in the past. Scholars have long talked about ice ages, each lasting between 50 and 100,000 years, which covered big areas of the northern hemisphere, including much of Europe and America as far south as modern New York, with great ice sheets sometimes a mile or more thick. They have now distinguished some 17 to 19. There is argument about the exact number. Such glaciations since the onset of the first over 3 million years ago. We live in a warm period following the most recent of them, which came to an end some 10,000 years ago. Evidence about these glaciations and their effects is now available from all oceans and continents, and they provide the backbone for prehistoric chronology. To the external scale which the ice ages provide, we can relate such clues as we have to the evolution of humanity. The ice ages make it easy to see how climate determined life and its evolution in the prehistoric times, but to emphasize their dramatic direct effects is misleading. No doubt, the slow onset of the ice was decisive and often disastrous for what lay in its path. Many of us still live in landscapes shaped by its scouring and gougings thousands of centuries ago. The huge inundations which followed the retreat of the ice as it melted must also have been locally catastrophic, destroying the habitats of creatures which had adapted to the challenge of Arctic conditions. Yet, they also created new opportunities. After each glaciation, new species spread into the areas uncovered by the thaw beyond regions directly affected, though the effects of the glaciations may have been even more important for the global story of evolution. Changes in the environment followed cooling and warming thousands of miles from the ice itself, and the outcome had its own determining force. Both aridification and the spread of grassland, for instance, changed the possibilities of spreading themselves open to the existing species. Some of those species form part of the human evolutionary story, and all the most important stages in that evolution of so far observed have been located in Africa, far from the ice fields. Climate can still be very important today, as contemplation of the disasters brought by the drought can show. But such effects, even when they affect millions of people, are not so fundamental as to slow transformation of the basic geography of the world and its supplies of food which climate wrought in prehistoric times. Until very recently, climate determined whether, where, and how men lived. It made technique very important and still does. The possession in early times of a skill such as fishing or fire making could make new environments available to branches of the human family fortunate enough to possess such skill or able to discover and learn them. Different food gathering possibilities in the different habitats meant different chances of a varied diet and eventually of progressing from gathering to hunting and then to growing. Long before the ice ages, though, and even before the appearance of the creatures from which humanity was to evolve, climate was setting the stage for humanity and thus shaping by selection and eventual genetic inheritance of humanity itself. One more backward glance is useful before plunging into the still shallow, though gradually deepening pool of evidence. 55 million or so years ago, primitive mammals were of two main sorts. One, rodent like, remained on the ground, the other took to the trees. In this way, the competition of the two families for resources was lessened, and strains of each survived to people the world with the creatures we know today. The second group were the Prosimians. We are among their descendants, for they were the ancestors of their first primates. It is best not to be too impressed by the talk about ancestors in any but the most general sense. Between the prosimians and ourselves lie millions of generations and many evolutionary blind alleys. It is important nonetheless that our remotest identifiable ancestors lived in the trees because what survived in the next phase of evolution were genetic strains best suited to the special uncertainties and accidental challenges of the forest. That environment put a premium on the capacity to learn. Those survived whose genetic inheritance could respond and adapt to the surprising sudden danger of deep shade, confused visual patterns, treacherous handholds. Strains prone to accidents in such conditions were wiped out. Among those which prospered, genetically speaking, were some species with long digits, which were to develop into fingers and eventually the oppositional thumb, and other forerunners of the apes already embarked upon an evolution towards three dimensional vision and the diminution of the importance of the sense of smell. The prosimians were little creatures. Tree shrews still exist, which give us some idea of what they were like. They were far from being monkeys, let alone men. Yet, for millions of years, they carried the traits which made humanity possible. During this time, geography counted for much in their evolution by imposing limits on contact between different strains, sometimes effectively isolating them and thus increasing differentiation. Changes would not happen quickly, but it is likely that fragmentations of the environment caused by geographical disturbance led to the isolation of zones in which, little by little, the recognizable ancestors of many modern mammals appeared. Among them are the first monkeys and apes. They do not seem to go back more than 35 million years ago or so. They represent a great evolutionary stride. Both families have much greater manipulative dexterity than any predecessor. Within them, species distinct in size or acrobatic quality began to evolve. Physiological and psychological evolution blur in such matters, like the development of better and stereoscopic vision. The growth of manipulative power seems to imply a growth of consciousness. Perhaps some of these creatures could already distinguish different colors. The brains of the first primates were already much more complex than those of any of their predecessors. They were bigger too. Somewhere, the brain of one or more of these strains became complex enough and its physical powers sufficiently developed for the animal to cross the line at which the world, as a mass of undifferentiated sensations, becomes, at least in part, a world of objects. Whenever this happened, it was a decisive step towards mastering the world by using it instead of reacting automatically to it. Some 25 or 30 million years ago, as desiccation began to reduce the areas of the forests, competition for diminishing forest resources became fiercer. Environmental challenge and opportunity appeared where the trees and the grasslands met. Some primates, not powerful enough to hold on to their forest homes, were able, because of their genetic quality, to penetrate the savannas in search of food and could meet the challenge and exploit the opportunities. Probably they had a posture and movement marginally more like that of men than, say, that of the gorillas or chimpanzees. An upright stance and the capacity to move easily on 2 feet make it possible to carry burdens, among them food. The dangerous open savanna could then be explored and its resources withdrawn from it to a safer home base. Most animals consume their food where they find it. Man does not. Freedom to use the four limbs for something other than locomotion or fighting also suggests other possibilities. We do not know what was the first tool, but other primates than man have been seen to pick up objects which come to hand and wave them as a deterrent, use them as weapons, or investigate and expose possible sources of food with their aid. The next step in the argument is enormous, for it takes us to the first glimpse of a member of the biological family to which both man and the great apes belong. The evidence is fragmentary, but suggests that some 15 or 16 million years ago, a very successful species was widespread throughout Africa, Europe, and Asia. Probably it was a tree dweller, and certainly specimens were not very large. They may have weighed about 40 pounds. Unfortunately, the evidence is such as to leave it isolated in time. We have no direct knowledge of its immediate forebearers or descendants, but some kind of fork in the road of primate evolution had occurred. While one branch was to lead to the great apes and chimpanzees, the other led to human beings. This line has been named hominid, but the first hominid fossil found in Kenya is dated only some 4.5 to 5 million years ago, so that for about 10 million years The record is obscure. During that time, big geological and geographical changes must have favored and disfavored many new evolutionary patterns. The first hominid fossil may not belong to it, but one evolutionary line which emerged from this upheaval was a small African hominid, subsequently named Australopithecus. The earliest fossil identified with this genus is more than 4 million years old and was found in Ethiopia. Evidence of other species of Australopithecines, as they were usually termed, found as far apart as Kenya and the Transvaal, can be dated to various periods over the next 2 million years and has had a great impact upon the archaeological thinking. In the last quarter century, something like 3 million years has been added to the period in which the search for human origins goes on, thanks to the Australopithecines discoveries. Great uncertainty and much debate still surrounds them. But if the human species has a common ancestor, it seems more likely that it belonged to a species of this genus. It is with Australopithecus, though, and with what, for want of a better word, we must call it contemporaries of other species, that the difficulties of distinguishing between apes, man like apes, and other creatures with some human characteristics first appeared in their full complexity. The questions raised are still becoming, in some ways, more difficult to deal with. No simple picture has yet emerged, and discoveries are still being made. We have most evidence about Australopithecus, but there came to live contemporaneously with some Australopithecine species, other, more man like creatures to whom the genus name Homo has been given. Homo was no doubt related to Australopithecus, but is first clearly identifiable as distinct about 2 million years ago on certain African sites. Remains attributed to one of his species, though have been dated by radioactivity to some 1.5 million years before that. Recently, to make confusion worse, the remains of an even bigger hominid have turned up near Lake Rudolph in northern Kenya. About 5 feet tall, with a brain about twice the size of a modern chimpanzee's. He has the undignified name of 1470 man, that being the number attached to his relics in the catalogue of Kenya Museum where they are to be found. Where specialists disagree and may be expected to go on arguing about such fragmentary evidence as we have, all that is left of 2 million or so years of hominid life could be put on a big table. Laymen had better not dogmatize. It is clear enough, though, that we can be fairly certain about the extent to which some characteristics later observable in humans already existed more than 2 million years ago. We know, for instance, that the Australopithecines, though smaller and modern humans, had leg bones and feet which were man like rather than ape like. We know they walked upright and could run and carry loads for long distances as apes could not. Their hands showed a flattening at the fingertips, characteristics of those of men. These are stages for far advance on the road of human physique, even if the actual descent of our species is from some other branch of the hominid tree.